First, we will remove the speed sensor. It is attached with a 12mm bolt. You may have to twist the sensor to remove it. Next, remove the shifter cable bracket. There are 3 12mm bolts that need to be removed. Remove the 3 12mm shift fork detent bolts, springs, washers, and ball bearings. Tip the transmission to get the ball bearings out of the holes. Remove the interlock bolt with an 8mm hex socket. Remove the 4 10mm bolts that hold the shifter change lever assembly. Note the location of the clutch line clip bracket. In this video, the top left and the bottom right bolts removed are longer than the top right and bottom left bolts. Remove the shifter change lever assembly. You may have to tap it with a mallet to break the Honda bond seal against the transmission. The assembly has dowel pins aligning it to the transmission, so you may need to wiggle the assembly to remove it. Remove the transmission oil drain bolt and washer. Remove the transmission oil filler plug and washer with a 17mm socket. Remove the flange bolt with a 14mm socket. Remove the countershaft snap ring cap with a 14mm hex socket. Remove the case bolts in a crisscross pattern with a 12mm socket. Note that these bolts are longer than the rest at these 2 points on the transmission. Keep track of the location of these case bolt mounted brackets during reinstallation. We now need to break the Honda bond seal of the transmission housing by using a pry bar on the following 2 leverage points. This shows the 2 halves being separated. We now need to spread the countershaft bearing snap ring. Insert needle nose pliers and spread the snap ring. The snap ring may stay spread, as shown here. If it doesn't, you may have to pry on the transmission pry point while spreading the snap ring. Now that the 2 halves are separated, and the snap ring is released from the bearing, lift the transmission housing. Remove the backup light switch with a 27mm socket. Remove the reverse lock cam with a 10mm socket. Remove the reverse gear shift fork with a 10mm socket. Remove the reverse idler gear and shaft. Remove the main shaft, counter shaft, and shift forks. Use a twisting motion on the shafts while pulling up. Remove the differential. Pull up while turning the differential. You may have to wiggle it while pulling up. Remove the counter shaft bearing retainer plate using a 10mm socket. Remove the magnet. Remove the axle oil seal. Only tap against the inner metal ring of the seal. Remove the transmission housing main shaft thrust shim with snap ring pliers. Remove the oil guide plate. Remove the oil gutter plate. Remove the existing axle oil seal. Again, only contact the inner metal ring of the seal. Remove the differential bearing shim from the transmission housing using snap ring pliers. We will now remove the input shaft bearing, using a pilot bearing puller and a slide hammer. Insert the pilot bearing puller and then twist to expand the puller's jaws. Make sure the puller's jaws fit tightly under the bearing's inner race. Remove the countershaft bearing. First, remove the needles, and then the plastic cage. Use a small flathead screwdriver to pop the needles out of the cage. Remove the countershaft bearing's outer race. This pilot bearing puller was not wide enough by using its inner screw, so we wedged needle nose pliers between the jaws to expand and support the jaws to be wider. Remove the oil guide plate. Remove the input shaft oil seal. Use a flathead screwdriver to pry against the lip of the seal. Be careful not to scratch the walls of the oil seal bore. Use protective plastic between the screwdriver and the transmission. We will now disassemble the main shaft. First, we will install a puller under the tapered cone ring, under the top angular ball bearing. Install the puller supports, main screw, and a socket for the puller to press against onto the bearing splitter. We used a 19mm socket that only contacts the main shaft, and not the bearing's inner race. Turn the main screw to pull off the bearing and collar. A ratchet can be used, but an impact gun is the fastest method. Remove the 5th gear synchro hub, synchro, 5th gear, needle bearing, distance collar, 4th gear and needle bearing, 4th gear synchro, and 3rd to 4th gear synchro sleeve. Install the puller behind 3rd gear. Make sure not to install the puller behind the gear that is part of the main shaft. Place a socket between the main screw and the main shaft. We used a 19mm socket. Turn the main screw to pull the rest of the gears. Remove the 3rd to 4th gear synchro hub, 3rd gear synchro, 3rd gear, and main shaft needle bearing. The synchro to hub clearance needs to be measured by a feeler gauge. The 5-speed from a base model RSX and the 6-speed from an RSX Type S call for different clearances. For this 5-speed transmission, Honda calls for a clearance of 0.7 to 1.49 mm. This service limit is 0.4 mm. If yours is below the service limit, replace the synchro. Honda recommends to replace the hub as well. Follow this procedure for all gear sets. We will now remove the countershaft bolt. Note that the top part of this shaft spins. While removing the bolt, hold a part of the countershaft that does not spin. Use a 12mm hex socket to remove the countershaft bolt. This is a reverse threaded bolt. To remove it, turn it clockwise. Install the puller behind the top bearing, with the flat part of the bearing splitter against the bearing. Use a socket to press against the top of the shaft. Remove the collar and shim. Use a puller to take off the 4th and 5th gear. These can be difficult to remove, so you may need to use a vise to hold the puller while you use a breaker bar to turn the puller screw. Install the reverse threaded bolt to protect the top of the shaft before installing the puller. Stop turning when the gears reach the top threaded nut. Remove the bolt. Reinstall the puller to remove the gears the rest of the way. Install the puller behind 2nd gear, with the flat side of the splitter against the gear. Remove the top bolt that we pressed against.
Remove the 2 gears, needle bearing, synchro, friction dampener, distance collar, and the 1st to 2nd gear slider.
We now need to remove the 1st gear synchro, the 1st gear, and the 1st to 2nd gear hub. To remove this, fit the puller to the countershaft. Reinstall the countershaft top bolt so the screw of the puller can press against it. Remove the countershaft top bolt. Remove the first gear hub, first gear synchro set, first gear, and the first gear needle bearing. We will now clean part of the transmission. The other parts of the transmission case can also follow these steps. First, rinse out the remaining debris and oil. Then, apply engine degreaser. After letting the degreaser set for a while, use a non-abrasive brush and scrub the inside of the case. Rinse the inside with hot water. Another solution that can be used is dish soap. Apply it to the transmission and use a brush or scrub pad. A green scrub pad may clean the best. Rinse with hot water. Clean the inside of the clutch housing. Make sure to wet the surface first, and do not breathe the dust in. We used dish soap and a green scrub pad on this surface. You may have to repeat this step a few times to clean it completely. Rinse with hot water.